It's my privilege just to say something about the E.B. van Wyk lecture series. After some discussion, and as Anna Maria said, between the two of us, we decided to introduce this lecture series because we felt that linguistics and language study in general is actually not catered for in terms of lecture series at our institutions generally. And then who better than Van Wyk, E.B. van Wyk, Professor E.B. van Wyk, to be the person that this lecture series should be named after. Let me just give you a few highlights of his career. And you will then understand why the two departments are actually both equally involved in honoring him in this fashion. Professor E.B. van Wyk was born on the 4th of July 1929 in Rustenburg. He completed his schooling and eventually married Marie Jacoba Hartzer, and the couple has 5 children. His wife passed away in 2010, sadly. Professor van Wyk is still living in a retirement home close to Jeffreys Bay. It's actually, close to Jeffreys Bay where he is at the moment. He matriculated at Petersburg High School, first class, and he passed his BA with distinction in 1949, majoring in Northern Sotho Zulu and anthropology at the University of Pretoria. He went on to obtain his MA and D Lit degrees cum laude. The title of his master's dissertation, Die Copulatieve van Noord-Sotho, and his doctoral thesis with the title Woordverdeling in Noord-Sotho and Zulu. He studied general linguistics with Professor Anton Reichling of the University of Amsterdam in 1964, and that is where his love for general linguistics started. He was appointed, if we look at his academic career, he was appointed junior lecturer in African languages at the University of Pretoria in 1950. He was then appointed as senior lecturer in African languages at UNISA in 1953. He then moved back to the University of Pretoria in 1954 as a senior lecturer. He was promoted to professor in African languages at the University of Pretoria in 1962. And in 1967, he accepted a post as professor in general linguistics at the then University of Port Elizabeth. In 1969, he accepted the post as professor in the Department of General Linguistics and Applied Linguistics and Literary Theory at this institution, which was back then named the Rand Afrikaans University. He held this post until 1988. Before he finally retired, he took up the position of professor in African languages at RAU from again in 1980 to 1994. He held various academic positions, HOD of the Department of African Languages and General Linguistics and Applied Linguistics at UP, UPE and RAU, as we already said. And he was also Dean of the Faculty of Humanities from 1976 until 1979. He also served on Senex and as a member of Senate on the Council of the University. The prominent positions he held outside his own institution was the Chair of Linguistic Society of Southern Africa, 1975 to 1981. He was a member of the Executive Linguistic Society of Southern Africa from 1982 to 1989. Vice Chair, National Karate Association of South Africa in 1981. A member of the National Place Names Committee, 1962 to 1995, Chair of the National Place Names Committee of the Department of National Education, Arts, Culture, Science and Technology, 1988 until 1995. Chair of the Stanon Project. That was a countrywide research project concerning the standard and non-standard varieties of the South African languages, conducted under the auspices of the Human Science Research Council from 1987 to 1991. He served as a member of the Committee of the Department of National Education for the subsidizing of journals and publications from 1992 to 1996, which is now known as the DOET subsidy system. In terms of publications, Prof. van Wyk published some 55 scientific articles and books covering topics such as African languages, Afrikaans, Japanese, language theory, phonetics, phonology, semantics, morphology, social linguistics, and applied linguistics. But I think the biggest attribute that we have of Van Wyk was the impact that his work had. And obviously back then, when he was at the peak of his academic career, there were no H factors, and I say this tongue in the cheek because that's the buzzword today. But the impact of his work was very evident. There was a time in the 1970s and 1980s where just about every postgraduate dissertation or thesis on an African language referred to the work of E.B. van Wyk. I also remember very clearly the time when all the African language heads of department, except one in the country, were actually students, prior students, postgraduate students of Professor E.B. van Wyk. He received numerous awards. The Via Africa Prize for the best publication in African languages was awarded twice to him. The prestigious award of the Linguistic Society of Southern Africa for his contribution in linguistics in 1980. The Stolz Prize from the South African Academy of Science and Art for his contribution to African language studies in 1990. He also received a special award from Rao for his academic contribution in 1990, a special award also in 1981 for his sport coaching. He was an honorary member of and still is, of the African Language Association of Southern Africa. And he is also an honorary member of the Linguistic Society of Southern Africa. He is a recipient of the Festschrift Linguistica, which was published in his honor in 1993. He won the Langenhoven Prize for Language Study from the South African Academy of Science and Art in 2000. But apart from all these accolades, we can also say that Professor van Wyk had time, I don't know how and when, to practice some of his hobbies, most notably photography. And he won numerous international prizes for his work in this field. He also, at a fairly later stage in his life, over 40 years old, took up karate, and he ended up being a third dan, black belt, in the Japanese, and also was given the award by the Japanese Karate Association for South African men over 40. He was a lover of music, nature, languages, and the Bible. I think if we have to say one thing about Van Wyk is that he actually loved languages to the extent that he actually was responsible for the introduction of general linguistics in our country and the continuation of the interest in general linguistics in our country. So with that background, then, I ask Anne-Marie to introduce our speaker tonight, who is also, as Anne-Marie has already hinted, a very illustrious academic and somebody whom incidentally we invited earlier this year to advise us in our university in terms of guidelines for the implementation plan for our language policy.
Ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs, Sani Bonani. It's a privilege to be invited to address this second Van Wyk Honorary Linguistics Public Lecture. So please allow me first to express my gratitude for this opportunity to the University of Johannesburg, the Department of African Languages and Linguistics, to Professor and Dean Postumus for this honor, and to all of those responsible for this event. This invitation also has, for me, an emotional resonance because, as Anne-Marie indicated, the first speaker, or the speaker for the inaugural lecture 2 years ago, was Neville Alexander. Both Neville and I were involved with the LinguaPax organization in Barcelona, and I have been and I remain a great admirer of his work. And it seems to me a particularly opportune time to reflect on the breadth and width and reach of Neville's work, not only as an intellectual, a revolutionary, and a social activist during the period of the apartheid regime, but also as a South African who was convinced of the liberating potential of this country's multilingualism, and how he believed, and he really believed, that there was a fundamental role to be played by African languages. I also think this is an opportune time to reflect on his message, because he had a number of insights and even warnings that unfortunately seem to be largely unheeded, as the government of South Africa, it seems, is increasingly showing a vision of the role of South Africa's 11 official languages with new laws, language policies, and, let's say, official pronouncements that only seem to admit the worth in one language for the country, and, in a sense, dismisses any value for African languages for the purpose of government. Now, before I begin, I have to apologize. Because I may not be very lively, as Anne-Marie indicated, I think. I arrived from Canada yesterday via Ethiopia, and so I'm not exactly, despite all the coffee I had today, I'm not exactly in top form. And I also have to make a confession. I will be presenting to you a mainly legal perspective. Since I'm a jurist, I have a legal background. I mean, I'm only a professor of law. Mm-hmm. And I'm sorry to say, I have absolutely no background in linguistics, social linguistics, or even political science. So perhaps this will be a slightly unusual or unconventional lecture to deal with very topical linguistics, but also social, political, and legal issues. Although I promise to try to do my best to go beyond a purely legal perspective. So it is my most sincere hope that you will all forgive me and not share the feelings of some of Shakespeare's characters in one of his plays when they described what they thought would be utopia. The sub-theme of my lecture on language rights and democracy is a question. Is there a place for African languages, or is the future English only in this country? In a sense, Neville himself, in a recently published book, hinted at the answer when he said that nothing would happen with African languages. They would remain powerless unless the government and private sector make them worthwhile. An important, some would even say essential, characteristic of a democratic society is the freedom for individuals to live a good life according to one's own choosing. And this is a core value of democracy. I'm going to connect that with much of Neville's writings, actually. This core value of democracy extends also to the possibility of choice, of options that are not limited to the private sphere, as some governments like to pretend, but also under certain conditions to linguistic choices in terms of access and enjoyment of public goods, including, I have to say, in the field of public education, but perhaps more importantly, public employment, public health, social services, and many other areas where the state, the government and its machinery, are often present, if not omni-powerful. My lecture deals with this understanding of democracy, of choices in language matters, and in particular, whether the government of South Africa has made the knowledge of African languages worthwhile, as Neville indicates is needed. Now, at the risk of preempting my lecture a little bit, let me suggest to you that currently this does not seem to be the case. The government of South Africa is not making knowledge and use of African languages worthwhile. If there are any representatives of the media, maybe you should take your pens or your recorder, since what I will say next is at the core of this lecture. As it stands, the government of South Africa appears to be on the path of actually preventing the use of 10 of this country's official languages, the African languages, of denying any linguistic choice in public affairs, and is imposing almost exclusively the use of English for government purposes, from public education to policing, in ways which would appear to serve mainly the interests of a small segment of the population of South Africa, those who are fluent in English, but not necessarily the majority of the population of this country. So let me begin by illustrating the theme of my lecture with 3 series of stories that make the link between language rights from a mainly legal point of view and the use of African languages in South Africa. The first stories, I think, will illustrate the mindset, which Neville, by the way, also warned about a number of years ago, of many government officials and leaders who are actively, if not necessarily intentionally, making African languages worthless in public life. The second stories that I will use will try to illustrate what, in my opinion, is a dangerous, well, I would use the word intolerance. Intolerance among those who are privileged, as they already are fluent, to a degree anyway, in English, and who react sometimes negatively, even aggressively, to any suggestion that other official African languages should be used in some areas of a government. The third story, or type of story, outlines the consequences of these first 2 categories. Where the elite is disdainful of African languages, which the government cements by actually prohibiting the use of African languages in many, if not most, fields of public life. And finally, I will have to wear my legal hat one last time to emphasize that the South African government cannot simply impose one official language, cannot simply impose English, in complete disregard of democratic values, including the need to respect certain human rights that affect language choices and the use by public authorities of different languages in settings such as universities, education, and other state institutions. As it stands, and I may be wrong on this, as I am wrong in many things in life, but as it stands, the government seems to assume that all language preferences for official purposes is a matter that remains at its discretion, even, I must say, apparently to the point of ignoring the Constitution. And that's an idea, that's a direction that is wrong legally, it is wrong morally, and I would say it's also quite wrong and impractical for various reasons. Ladies and gentlemen, please allow me first to share a few stories on the mindset which seems to prevail in the current proposals in relation to African languages under legislation and upcoming language policies for various government departments, and how it denies the idea of equality between the official languages of South Africa, as former President Nelson Mandela assumed would eventually be the case. Last month, this is my first story. Last month, there was a court case. There was a court case before the Equality Court in Cape Town, where the plaintiff, a Brits lawyer named Mr. Lourens, argued that the national laws of South Africa should be in all 11 official languages. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the legal arguments, but there's even an argument that if you have an official national language, at the very least, the laws should reflect the importance of that symbolic recognition. It's pretty basic, in fact, in many countries. Now, as some of you, in fact, I assume most of you know, currently, the national laws are for all practical purposes in English only. What happens is that with the English version, there will be another version in one of the other 10 official languages, but it could be any version. One law may have a version in Zulu or Xhosa or Tshivenda or any other language, but there's no consistency. There's actually no logic to it. It all depends on whatever available or convenient. It really is completely discretionary. By the way, this is a practice which no other country in the world does. And the reason no other country in the world has this kind of approach is that it makes no logical sense. If you have one law, such as the criminal law, in English, and you have it in another language, then, for example, the changes to the criminal law should be in the same second language, just so you can follow what the changes are. This is not happening in South Africa. You might have the criminal law, as a purely example, in Zulu, and then if there are any changes, any amendments, it might 2 years later be in Zulu, or then another amendment a few years later in Xhosa. So you cannot follow any of the other official languages. You can only follow the English version. So for practical purposes, the laws are in fact only one language, English. In this Equality Court case last month, one of the government's leading lawyers presented his opening argument in this way. Everyone in South Africa speaks English. By not using English, Mr. Lourens, by the way, was using Afrikaans to present his case, which he is entitled to do, according to the laws here in South Africa. But by not using English, Mr. Lourens was being essentially a dogmatic troublemaker, because he was excluding other lawyers who were not fluent in Afrikaans. Now, without commenting on the false statement that everyone in South Africa knows English or is fluent in English, what he is really saying here, by the way, is that those who count understand English. And if you don't understand English, you don't really count anyway, okay? His arguments represented also the position of one part, or it seems, of the government of South Africa. Only English should be used, because using any of the other official African languages excludes others. And only English is inclusive of everyone, even though this is actually not true. The other story in this category, as to what seems to be the mindset with certain elements or certain segments of government, connects directly with what Neville argued was necessary. The government must make African languages worthwhile. After losing a court case in 2010, so about 4 years ago, against the same Mr. Lourens does seem to pop up every often, the government of South Africa was ordered by the judge to adopt a law which would provide for at least the use of 2 official languages in order to respect the Constitution. The government had, in essence, been arguing at that point that using only English was practical. Therefore, well, we shouldn't bother too much with the Constitution. the government, as a consequence of the court order, adopted the Use of Official Languages Act, where the government promised, it is a promise under this legislation, that it will use at least 3 official languages. Instead of 2 under the Constitution, the government seemed to be more generous. We will use at least 3 official languages. But the legislation, that law, actually does not identify which of these languages will be used. Only that it will use English and 2 or more other of the 10 official languages. That promise in the Use of Official Languages Act is that the languages, the other languages which will be used, will come out later with the language policies which each national government department and most government institutions will be adopting apparently by the end of this year or sometime in November. And that, one could say, if one is generous, that was a good promise, because we were moving towards the use of 3 official languages for government purposes. Well, we are now at the end of September, and there are some of these language policies, official languages policies, which are beginning to appear on the radar. There is a first language policy which the Road Accident Fund has started to circulate. And remember, these are the policies which are supposed to identify which official languages the government of South Africa will be using to respect the Constitution. And here under this, to my knowledge, the first official languages policy that we have, what do we have? What is the answer as to which African languages are to be used for government purposes? Which African languages will be worthwhile, to use some of Neville's terms? And the answer is, well, we still don't know, actually. We still don't know, because this language policy actually does not say. The government, through this first language policy, simply or mainly says that English will always be used. But then it stops. Basically, it stops. It still refuses to say where, when, and even if any other African languages will be used. It says only that it will try, and I emphasize try, sometimes to use other official languages where it is required. The plain, simple, and undiplomatic meaning of this language policy is that, and this is rather rude, and I apologize, it is that African languages are worthless. Worthless under this first government language policy because, oh, by the way, this policy is only available in English, to my knowledge. That's probably not a good sign. Because even, by the way, in the title, look at the title. Official language. It's actually the official language policy, not languages in plural, singular. Now, I don't want to make too much fuss over that. Now, George Orwell would be proud of this policy. He would be proud because, on the one hand, the policy states, it does have good principles. It does say, for example, that the policy seeks to promote the equitable use of all 11 official languages and to offer redress for the previously marginalized indigenous languages. That's good. But then, what does it do in more solid, concrete terms? Then it says it does actually almost nothing for any other language except English. It enshrines, in essence, it enshrines English only and excludes to a large degree the use of all African languages. It says, for example, all languages have equal status and are to be treated equitably. Okay, let's just think. All languages have equal status, and it's absolutely false. It's false, because this language policy, the first indication of where the government is heading, indicates that only English has a status, in fact. English, under this provision, shall be the operating language of the road accident fund. Okay, if you have equal status, where are the other official languages? They're not there. There's only a status for English. It's so bizarre because it's actually contradictory. I must say, for looking from the outside, someone with a legal background, this is a direct contradiction. You're in fact rejecting what you said earlier. All languages do not have equal status under this first language policy. Only English has a particular status, and all the rest follow, and where they follow is way behind, as a matter of fact. I'm not here for my diplomatic skills, by the way. I'm not. I'm afraid that's not one of my strong points. I do have a few, but not that one. So let me be very diplomatic and use a technical term lawyers like to use, which is unfortunately not very polite. So I beg your forgiveness. I will blame it on jet lag by saying that African languages are being shafted by the government with this first language policy. The words used here from a legal point of view, but they were drafted by lawyers, and they have a clear meaning. English shall be used. The word shall here indicates that the use of English is mandatory. They must use English. So, and all of the other languages, what happens to them? They may be used. Equal status? Absolutely not. May is permissive. It's left to the government or the officials, we have to see later on, but there is no actual obligation. It's not mandatory to use the other African official languages. Only the use of English is mandatory. Apparently first official language policy outlines is not obliged to use any African language, even where the situation would demand it, and even though the Constitution itself demands also the use of at least 2 official languages. Here, there's only one official language that has to be used, English. And in my opinion, although I'm not a constitutional expert on the Constitution of South Africa, but in my opinion, what you have here does absolutely not seem to respect the Constitution of this country. Only English must be used. All the other languages, maybe, and I outline maybe. Technically, by the way, this means that there is no breach of the policy if only English is ever used in the whole of South Africa, and no African language is used at all under this section 7.6.1, because the policy itself actually does not force the use of any African language. You can complain under this policy, but your complaint could be automatically dismissed, since the policy is respected even if only English is ever used, in other words. Now, an ungenerous observer might suggest that the government is increasingly preventing the use of African languages in most fields of public life through this language policy. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but I'm using this for illustrative purposes. Because in the end, it does seem to suggest a pattern which not only privileges the use of English, but requires it and says, well, maybe we will use other languages, but we will not even say where, when, or why. The second line of stories that I have is the growing, as I use the word, intolerance. And I think intolerance, slightly strong word, but does describe some of the responses among, let's call them the privileged, I would say privileged English-speaking segment of society against African languages. Just a few months ago, I say that because I had this strange experience a few months ago at the University of Pretoria with one of my students, when she started complaining about the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And she raised the issue with me, and she said, isn't it this terrible that the University of KwaZulu-Natal is actively discriminating against me and others because it's suggesting that some courses at the University of KwaZulu-Natal will be using the Zulu language in the future. Now, this was a very nice lady, middle-class, English-speaking South African, complaining that she was a victim of discrimination because, well, she was not fluent in Zulu. According to her, allowing Zulu excluded poor little her, and anyone else who did not speak Zulu, and therefore was exclusionary. By the way, the word exclusionary is important here. She's saying the same thing as one of the government lawyers in the equality case last month. Therefore, it should not be allowed, as it did not include everyone, and the only way you could include everyone is, of course, by using, according to her logic, English. I'm, once again, exaggerating slightly, but for the purposes of illustration. Notice how the logic that she uses here does not recognize that a large segment of the population of South Africa is not fluent in English. I mean, I know that, and I assume most of you know that. Many people may have a knowledge of English, but the level of literacy or eloquence in the English language, I would say, is probably limited or relatively low for a very large percentage of the population, if not even a majority, in fact, of South Africans. These non-native speakers of English seem invisible in her view. They don't seem to count, do they? And therefore, they're not important. So, in her world, which is the world, I think, of not all, but some who are either monolingual English speakers or are extremely fluent in the English language, for individuals like her, preventing any use of African languages is necessary in the name of inclusiveness. Look at how narrow that is, though. We're being inclusive, but we'll not really take into consideration the very large percentage of people in South Africa who are not fluent in English. That's inclusiveness, or I think that's a rather bizarre form of inclusiveness, which is actually quite exclusionary, if you think about it. And what it also fails to realize is that from a legal point of view, her argument that the use of any African language is exclusionary and therefore discriminatory is absolutely false. It's not true, not from a legal point of view. This behind me is one of the few, in fact, I think it's the only case that ever went to the International Court of Justice, where the International Court of Justice made comments about language policies and discrimination. The International Court of Justice usually does not deal with human rights cases. So this was an unusual situation involving Namibia, or at the time Southwest Africa. And there, one of the judges indicated, Judge Tanaka, indicated that using separate languages for educational purposes was generally not discriminatory, as long as it was not racial, by the way. But simply having a school or a university, public university, teaching in a particular language was not discriminatory as long as it was a reasonable difference of treatment. Once again, I'm not going to go through a legal analysis, but people or individuals may be excluded or just disadvantaged, and this happens all the time. As long as the reasons, the justification for a difference of treatment which causes a disadvantage are justified, and as long as the effects for some individuals is proportionate, given trying to attain some kind of legitimate purpose, this is not discrimination in international human rights law. In most countries, for example, this is a simple example, individuals under the age of 18 do not have the right to vote. They're excluded, or they're seriously disadvantaged, but this is considered to be reasonable and justified in those, and therefore not discriminatory, as are these other visual examples you have here. Racial preferences would in almost all cases be considered automatically in human rights, international human rights, as prohibited discrimination, but it's not the same if you only have linguistic preferences which are rational and proportionate. And just to go backward once again, Judge Tanaka said, this is the International Court of Justice, the World Court, when you're dealing with educational facilities, it's completely logical to have a school or a university teach in a particular language and respond to the needs of a local population. In most cases of public education, even at the university level. Education in Zulu, Xhosa, or Afrikaans, because of their demographic weight and concentration, geographic concentration in South Africa, would make perfect sense. It would be probably reasonable and justified to teach in these languages, contrary to what this nice middle-class English-speaking student in Pretoria honestly believed. She honestly believed what she stated. There's no bad faith in her position. You will also remember what some of the government lawyers have started to argue in court in recent cases. This is becoming more common, by the way, that government lawyers in court cases involving language are arguing that the use of African language excludes others. So therefore, it's only practical to use English. Now, this is a very dangerous argument. It really means there's no space left for the use of any African languages at all. If you use the argument, everyone understands English, not everyone understands Zulu, therefore, if we use Zulu, we are excluding others. We cannot do that. That's discriminatory. That's the end of the worth of African languages. Your languages, the African languages, will be worthless because the government is saying we should not use African languages because they exclude those who do not know Zulu or Xhosa or any other language. There's no chance. If that logic prevails, if this is the direction the government of South Africa is going, that is really the end of the use eventually of African languages, except maybe a music festival, a poetry festival, and a few other nice events, which everyone can enjoy. Last year I went to a game park in the north here, where I couldn't help but overhear, once again, a rather well-to-do looking South African couple speaking with their young son. He might have been 6 or 7. The husband and wife would speak to each other, I think it was in Sotho, but whenever they turned around, whenever they spoke to their son, they would only speak to him in English. And you have no idea how strange that seems to an outsider. This is also the phenomenon which you all know about, that many families in South Africa do not want their children to be taught in African languages, and they're demanding to be taught in English instead because, and there's no mystery here, of course, they feel this will be the language which will give their children the most opportunities in life. I don't blame them. Do you blame them? Isn't that the way South Africa is going? They're right. They're right in a sense. The attitudes of many who are in power and the legislation you have now here and the language policy that I showed you earlier have become clearer in recent years and even months, and they could result in public education, in health, social services, jobs in the civil service, all requiring English, all making English the entry door to these opportunities. Not because this is natural, because this is the diktat, the order, the way the government is organizing the whole state and its machinery. English is a language required for employment in many, if not most, if not all jobs with the government of South Africa. Not Zulu, the largest language group in this country, not Xhosa or other African languages, despite these being the largest languages in the country. Despite the richness, the beauty of languages like Zulu, the government project is that they're worthless, really. And that is what the various attitudes, actions, and laws of the government seems to be portraying. Increasingly, if policies such as the Road Accident Fund follow the same path, what you have is increasingly the exclusion by order of the government and public officials of other African official languages. This, by the way, is not unique to South Africa. You're in the company of countries such as China, which since about the 1990s, the Chinese government is moving more and more towards a Mandarin-only official policy. Mandarin, or as is officially known, Putonghua, the common language. That's pretty clever, by the way. You say, by using Putonghua, the common language, what the government of China is saying is that Mandarin is the language of everyone, like English is the language of everyone here. In Tibet, the autonomous region of Tibet, about 92%, 95% of the population officially are ethnic Tibetans. And their language is, for the vast majority of them, Tibetan. So the number of Chinese speakers or Mandarin speakers is actually quite low in Tibet. But since about the 1990s, or let's say about 20 years, a bit more, the government of China is requiring more and more the exclusive fluency in the Mandarin language. Not Tibetan, even though officially the government of Tibet is supposed to be bilingual. It has two official languages. And what's been happening, since the government is saying Mandarin is the only language you require for employment in the civil service, it's the only language of university education since about the 1980s. And if you want to go to university, you have to be fluent in Putonghua, in Mandarin, not Tibetan. What's been happening is, in terms of employment in the civil service, for example, this. Now remember, this shows clearly that by imposing the common language, Putonghua, as the only language of employment in the civil service, you're not being fair. You're not treating the Tibetans equally with the ethnic Chinese. You're privileging those who have Chinese as their mother tongue. And in terms of employment, the ethnic Tibetans, remember, they're about 95% of the population in that area. In fact, today, they're clearly less than half of the civil servants. Ethnic Chinese are being privileged through the use, for government purposes, of only one official language, Mandarin, Putonghua. More and more Tibetan parents know that university education is in Mandarin only, and that almost no civil service jobs require knowledge of Tibetan anymore. So those parents, in the same way as here in South Africa, are increasingly sending their children to Mandarin medium schools, because Tibetan is basically worthless outside of the home and community because of the policies, the language policies of the Chinese government. Doesn't it sound familiar a bit? Let me try to connect these stories with what can be described as language rights in international law, which involve human rights, treaties, and legal obligations. This is more of a legal dimension of my presentation. The legal perspective in relation to language rights is only concerned with whether, in practice, in relation to the use of any language, including an official one, a country's language policy or legislation or practice results in restrictions or preferences which may be in violation of particular human rights obligations. And I've divided the legal aspect of where you might have different types of human rights violations depending on language policies of the government. I'm not going to go through all of that. But the common thread here, which I think needs to be emphasized, is that, legally speaking, human rights problems do not appear because of the choice or even the actual use of an official language, but mainly when a country's official language policy is exclusive, does not allow the use of other languages in addition to the main or the practical language used by government. Especially in the context where you have large numbers of individuals who are not fluent in the language privileged by government, or you have, in fact, a large percentage of the population who do not know the official language at all. To use exclusively one official language disadvantages, in a way which is unreasonable, unjustified, individuals on the basis of language. And this exclusive use of only one language, in some contexts, can violate human rights as I have described here. I have to make this point clear. We're not talking about laws or human rights to protect languages. I make this point because I think there's a bit of confusion in different practices. From a legal point of view, human rights are only interested in one thing, individuals. Human rights are individual rights. And by referring here to human rights such as discrimination, we are looking at whether individuals are affected, not whether this is a disadvantage for a particular language. This is also important because legally, with human rights, we are not involved with trying to treat languages identically. That's neither possible, it's not appropriate according to a human rights legal perspective. We have to look at, from a human rights approach, how individuals are dealt with, not languages as such, and especially if any individuals are affected, disadvantaged, or denied a benefit or an advantage through a state's language preferences. So whatever the language policy, it is possible that there will be human rights issues if you have individuals who are excluded or disadvantaged as a consequence of these policies. And from a legal point of view, language policies may also have, and this we sometimes forget, they may also have economic or educational consequences because of the dominance of one language in a state, which can be an advantage, a special advantage in terms of access to and distribution of public resources for individuals who have a greater fluency in the official or majority language. And I'll try to illustrate this with one example. And I like to use this example because I get to speak French. French is my first language. By the way, all of my education was in French. I learned English as a foreign language in Canada. Let's say I always wanted to be a politician, by the way. I am the president of this country, and we will call this country Acadia. This is Acadia, I'm French, and I say, I will give all of you who are fluent in French a guaranteed job for life and $1 million. Combien parmi vous parlez français? Only one? Come on, two? Okay. There's, let's say, half a dozen. This is a language policy of this country, of me as the government. Do you think that's fair? Privilege 6 people, let's say 6. The vast majority are excluded. You don't have a sense that you're being disadvantaged or excluded in an unreasonable, disproportionate way? I would. Of course you are. And you know what? Things like that can be happening here in South Africa. Using English only may exclude individuals, disadvantage them in a way which, if you really look at it, especially if you have a large number of people affected, is not reasonable. That because there are ways of accommodating in a proportionate, practical way more people. Is it really reasonable to only give $1 million to 6 of you in this whole country? Of course not. Some of the economic consequences or educational consequences, I think, are relatively clear. For example, a number of studies show in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, and a few other parts of the world, that only using one official language for the purposes of education can be almost disastrous in some contexts. By the way, I don't think it's a coincidence that countries with the world's lowest literacy rates are often countries where public education is, or was until recently, taught in only one official language, not understood by the majority of the population of the country. Now, to me, once again, as an outsider, I find that almost bizarre. But the example of Burkina Faso, I think, is brilliant. Burkina Faso is the country with the lowest literacy rate in the world. And Burkina Faso is also peculiar in the sense, even for Africa, because that government, until recently, imposed rather strictly until recently, French only as the language of education in public schools. Now, the problem with that, it's only about 15% of the population in Burkina Faso understands French fluently. Now, there are a number of studies that refer to this, and some of you are more knowledgeable in this area than I am. But teaching someone in a language they don't understand is not the most effective pedagogical tool available. And partially, there are other reasons, of course. I'm simplifying, I have to. But partially, the effect, the extremely low literacy rate in Burkina Faso is directly linked to the fact that most students at a lower age actually do not understand the language of the teacher. And in fact, the teacher very often does not really master the French language. So you have a double whammy, a double negative situation in a sense. There is a growing body of evidence, by the way, in a number of countries, including South Africa, and this is part of a study I think some of you might have been involved with, but also in other places such as in Asia and Latin America, particularly with indigenous people, that show that using even the official language as medium of education, where a very large segment of the population is not fluent in that language, leads to generally, not always, but generally poor school performance, higher dropout rates for individuals who are not taught in their own language, and overall less effective public education, especially where you have large minorities or indigenous peoples that are territorially concentrated, for a variety of reasons, which I will not have time to go through. Interestingly, although research on this point has not gone much beyond a number of national studies, there seems to be a direct correlation between high illiteracy rates and the proportion of children who are not taught in their own language. If you look at educational practices, for example, in European countries, including those with more than one official language, there is quite a low disconnect between the medium of instruction and mother tongue. In other words, the vast majority of children throughout Europe are taught in their own language. And most European, not all of them, but most European language countries use more than one language as medium of instruction, where they have a relatively large minority that is concentrated. It's almost the opposite in a number of African and Latin American countries, especially those that have large indigenous populations. These have a high proportion of disconnect between the medium of instruction and mother tongue. And it may not be a coincidence that it seems that these also have the highest levels of illiteracy and poor academic results in the world. Once again, I'm simplifying because we don't have enough time to go through all of the different factors that can be involved. But when you have a country that has been through a war or internal conflict, or where you, in fact, have extreme poverty, it may be quite clear that these factors will weigh heavily in terms of illiteracy rates. But all things being equal, it also seems that having education in only one language it will be detrimental if this is not also a language which is understood by a significant proportion of the population. Since I know that there is an issue as to the language to be used in public universities, may I also say that there is, may I point out, there is absolutely no suggestion in countries with more than one language that there can only be one medium of instruction in public universities. To put it another way, when you have a country with more than one official language, it's actually quite prevalent to have universities teaching in these official languages. For example, Canada has a large number of French medium universities, a number of bilingual medium universities also. Finland has two official languages, quite a relatively small Swedish-speaking minority. It also has tertiary education, teaching in the Swedish language. Ireland, Wales, and quite a few other countries have bilingual or single medium universities teaching when you have more than one official language in the same country. There was even a country in Europe, Macedonia. We don't hear Macedonia very often, but in Macedonia a few decades ago, they actually had a civil war or an ethnic conflict. And one of the main demands of the rebels was they wanted a university that taught in their language. They were an Albanian-speaking minority and representing about 20 to 30% of the population, and only about 500,000 people, actually, a bit more than 500,000. They went to war, and one of their main demands was, we want a public university, a university teaching in our language. After 20 years, they have 3 now. They have 1 private Albanian medium language university and 2 bilingual universities teaching in the Albanian minority language, and I would say mainly teaching in their language. And this is why, for example, this is also, I should say, an area still developing in international law, but in terms of language use and national policies and the right of non-discrimination, there is a need for reasonable and justified language preferences by a government. In other words, you need to have some kind of linguistic proportionality. If you have a sufficiently large and especially concentrated language group, there is a right to have their language used to an appropriate degree in the institutions and activities of the state, including employment and education. And this is why, for example, the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights a few years ago was looking at the educational needs of the Arabic-speaking population of Israel, and where it the committee indicated that the government should establish, actually had to establish, a public university teaching in that language. As you may know, the Arab-speaking minority in Israel itself are somewhere between 20 and 25% of the population, I think. What the committee is actually doing here is applying an understanding of the relationship between equality, non-discrimination, and the right to education in terms of human rights. And this is also a kind of understanding which is relatively young. It's not that old in practice in international law, but it also seems to have been playing or operating in this relatively recent case in Namibia, where you had the United Nations Human Rights Committee, in the case of Diergaard versus Namibia, look at the situation where, under the constitution of that country, only English was recognized. And there was a government directive, a circular, a document sent to civil servants saying, you must only use English. That's the official language of the country. The basic conclusion here is that a language policy of exclusively using only English, not the status of English as official, but exclusively using English and refusing to additionally use some other languages, could amount to discrimination if it is unjustified, unreasonable, and arbitrary. Here, the government of Namibia was simply asked, why are you using English only? Because you have a lot of civil servants who are fluent. In this case, it was Afrikaans. You have a lot of civil servants who are fluent in Afrikaans. In that part of Namibia, Rehoboth, the people there, population there, actually speaks mainly Afrikaans. Why not use Afrikaans to a degree where it's needed? And why are you only using or imposing English? Exclusively. Always remember that, exclusively. And the government of Namibia said nothing, which was probably a legal mistake, tactical mistake, I should say. Because of that, the committee said, well, it's not reasonable to only use English. You haven't explained why only using English, when in fact most people there speak another language. Therefore, it's discrimination. Therefore, it is a violation of international law. To prevent the use of all languages in public life, except one, regardless of the reality on the ground, relegates, in essence, all other languages to the home and the private sphere. This is not conducive to respecting or promoting linguistic diversity because it basically eliminates the domains where most languages may be used and really restrains, limits the opportunities associated with the use of other languages. So ironically, South Africa, which has 11 official languages under the Constitution, of which at least 2 has to be used, may be going down the path of Namibia and China. Because there have been pronouncements that suggest that only English would be used in tertiary education. More and more schools are being led to only teach through the medium of English. Police departments are being instructed to use only English, and the new law and language policies on the use of official languages only require the use of English. There is, as of yet, no guarantee which other languages might be used in any part of the world to a large degree. This policy of the almost exclusive use of English, contrary to the Constitution and probably also discriminatory from a human rights point of view, is an unfortunate, if perhaps unconscious, frontal attack on the country's linguistic diversity. And this, I would say, is, to a large degree, many aspects, if this is the direction that you are heading, in terms of international human rights law, may be discriminatory and not really necessary or practical. It is possible to accommodate even quite a very high degree of linguistic diversity by governments in practice, as you have as in countries behind me, such as Ethiopia and India and Switzerland. Switzerland has 4 official languages. India has 2 national official languages and about another 40, by the way, on a regional basis. Ethiopia is the same way. Ethiopia has 1 or 2 national official languages, and I think 6 regional official languages, where in fact the government, the employment for these regional governments operate in the local language. For example, in Ethiopia, the largest language is actually Oromo, and Oromo is the official language in a number of these states in Ethiopia, where the language reflects the reality on the ground. There's nothing difficult to use an official language like Oromo, where the population is concentrated because the people already speak that language. There's no practical difficulty in using Zulu in parts of the country, and it's very clear where there is a concentration of Zulu speakers. Where you have a concentration of Zulu speakers, government should be effective in communicating and services to that population. An effective government, in terms of service and communication, should, must, can use the language on the ground. And in many parts of South Africa, that already is in place. There's no practical difficulty. You might need to train some people to have courses further developed, but if Ethiopia can do it, oh, come on. India? Come on. They can do it. You can too. You should be a shining example for the rest of Africa. The Ethiopians, by the way, many of them are very proud of their multilingual policies that are put in effect. You should be proud also, but not if this continues in the same direction. So let me finish by saying you've been very patient, but adding also that all of the stories that I mentioned earlier warn us about, what they warn us about is that the linguistic choices of the people of South Africa are in fact fast disappearing. You will simply not have any linguistic choices anymore unless the government is made to see the light and respect both the letter but also the spirit of the Constitution, where you have tolerance, multilingualism, and multicultural, I thought, as central values. And one could even ask the question, are we really truly democratic? Is it really a democratic way of dealing with the views and preferences of millions of non-English speakers in this country if public life is only seen through the lens of a non-African language? I say this because if the government goes ahead with the current flavor of the language policy and legislation and the attitudes which are now taking shape, from a legal point of view, only the use of one official language will be assured, and that's English. There is no mention in this policy, and I think other policies that are taking shape right now, there's no mention of Zulu as a language of use. How is that possible when Zulu is the largest language group in this country? There's no mention of the right to use Xhosa or any other language under the Road Accident Fund and other drafts that I have seen. English only, and English exclusively with no real concession for African languages. Is that the future of African languages in South Africa? Is that the monocolored view of the government in language matters, which chooses to ignore, and I must say, it chooses to ignore scientific evidence as to the value and effectiveness of the use of other languages where this is practical, and it also seems to be choosing to ignore its legal obligations under the Constitution and international human rights. Are African languages really have so little worth? I hope not. Thank you. Merci. Thank you.